Hello, today we're going to be learning how to make a GTA style death screen and Garry's mod. We're going to be learning how to have the text fade in and out, have colors fade and brightness turn down, and also restrict the time it takes for a player to respawn. So let's get started. Hello and welcome. So before we get started, I just want to make sure that you guys do have a basic understanding of hooks and networking. If you do not have an understanding of either of those, I strongly recommend you check out my Garry's Mod Loop tutorial series. I have a playlist which will show you how to understand hooks and networking. So for our setup here, we just have in our shared file, just an empty little file here with a print saying that the file loaded. On top of that, for our server side, we have a table full of net messages that we're going to be adding with util.add network string. So we just loop over that table here. We have a hook which is called player death think, and you can see here for player death think, this is a function that will prevent players from respawning by pressing space or clicking if we return false. And then on top of that, we have the player death hook, which is called whenever the player dies, we can get the victim, inflictor, and attacker. Then we have the player spawn hook, which is called whenever a player spawns in. And then we also have the player death sound, which we can return a value in to disable the sound, which I'm going to do now, which is just by returning true. So that will get rid of that beeping sound that you hear whenever the player dies. Next, for our client side file, we can just see that we have two fonts set up here, which is tutorial 24 and tutorial 90. They have a weight of 1,000, and we'll be using this for drawing text. Then we have a hook called render screen space effects, which is going to be used to draw our color modification. And you can see we have a table full of values here, which we can actually go ahead and copy down now. So we can use this for later. So we have this tab here. And then if we go ahead and draw this here and save this and hop in game now, you can see that we have some pretty wonky looky colors. We'll get that back to normal in just a second. I'm going to keep continuing to go over the setup. We have a HUD Paint hook. This is where we're going to be drawing the text for the little wasted text. And then we're going to have a CalcView, which is a hook that will basically allow you to modify the origin and angles of your view angles. And so we're going to need that for making the camera move side to side and backwards. Now that we have that all set up, what we're going to want to do is just get our color modification here back to normal. So we don't want to add any red. We don't want to add any green. On top of that, our color, we can set this back to 1. And then our multiplier for the green can be set to 0. So if I save this now, you can now see everything looks normal again. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is have some form of communication between the client and server whenever a player dies. So that's why we have these net messages here. The first thing we want to do is take this send death, and whenever the player dies, we're going to call net.start this net message here, and then we're going to send this to the victim. So the victim will get a notification from the server that they died. And so whenever that happens, we're going to go ahead and receive, and we can go ahead and set up a value here such as death t, which is going to store the time at which the player died. So we're just going to say cur time, which is the current amount of times in seconds that the server has been up. So we're going to go ahead and store that there. Now that we have that, we can go ahead and say if death t, then, and we can go ahead and, for example, change a value inside this table. So one thing I want to do is have a target for our brightness, and I want to set that to, for example, -0.2. And the reason why we want to do this is just so we can subtract from the brightness and get to this target value over time. But for now, what I'm going to want to do here is if death t exists, the time that they died, then I'm just going to go ahead and update this table here and update the brightness to our target value. Okay, so now that we've updated the value here, if I go ahead and save this, you'll notice that nothing has happened or changed in the game. But if I go ahead and die now, you can now see that the brightness is in fact very low, and it still pertains or is persistent whenever you die. So the next thing we want to do is have some form of communication between the server and client is whenever the player actually respawns. So we're just going to do the same thing that we did here for the player death, but instead of sending it to the quote-unquote victim, we're going to send it to PLY, which could also be the victim in this case. So then over here, what we're going to say is net.receive, and we can take that death value and we can just set it to nil, meaning it doesn't exist. Instead of just setting the value to nil, one thing we're going to want to do is actually set the brightness back to its default value. So we can go ahead and set depth t to nil, and then we can go tab brightness, and we can set that back to 0. So now go ahead and die, respawn. You can now see everything is back to normal. Okay, this kind of works. However, there is some things we want to change. So we want this to actually kind of fade in and out in terms of the brightness. And actually we want to add in support for color here. So first thing I'm going to do is set up some form of fade time. So I'm going to create a variable here called fade t, and we're going to set this to 4. Okay. Then what we want to do is inside our render screen space effects where we update this value of the brightness, we're going to want to check to see if depth t exists and depth t plus the fade time is greater than cur time. And the reason why we want to do this is we only want this code to execute for 4 seconds. So for example, whenever the player dies and cur time is set to 0, and cur time counts up every single second, if this is 0, this will be 4. And then basically our total value here will be 4, and cur time will also be 0 at the same time that depth t is created. So every second, cur time will climb up to 1, to 2, to 3, to 4, while this will always maintain the value of 4 until depth t is updated again by the player dying. So whenever this happens, whenever depth t is updated, cur time will be 4 seconds behind until it actually climbs up and reaches that value. So what we want to do now is basically subtract from our brightness and color within 4 seconds to reach our target values. For our color, my target value for this is actually going to be 0.1. So what I'm going to want to do now is I'm going to go ahead and set up some form of color subtraction and brightness subtraction. So we're going to do color sub equals, and then we'll do 0.9 because we're at 1 right now, right? And so we want to reach 0.1, and we want this to happen within 4 seconds, or our fade t. So we're going to divide this by fade t, and then we're going to multiply this by frame time. If I did not divide this by 4, this would actually subtract 0.9 immediately every second. So we want to divide this by 4, so it'll give us a smaller increment. So every second it will be subtracting by this small increment. So we get this nice transition of colors. Next thing we want to do is set up our brightness sub. So if we're starting at 0 and we want to reach 0.2, we're going to subtract 0.2, and we're also going to divide this by our fade time and multiply that by frame time. Now that we have this here, what we can do is we can go ahead and update these values in the table. So if I do tab, and then we'll do color brightness, and then we can say equals tab current value of the brightness minus our brightness sub. And then next thing we can do is go ahead and just update the same thing here, but for the color. And so we'll do our color sub. And so that will go ahead and do that. So I believe we should be good to give this a shot. We're also going to need to reset our color now back to 1 whenever they respawn. So let's go ahead and do that. And now if I die, you can now see that within 4 seconds, everything starts to fade. It's very, very sad. Our guy is dead. We respawn and we are good. Okay, cool. So that works out just fine. Now what we want to do is add in our HUD Paint for our, or actually instead of our HUD Paint, let's go ahead and add in the CalcView for the positioning and changing of angles. So first thing we want to do is just check to see if the player is alive. If they're alive, then we're just going to return end, meaning that this code is not going to be executed. And I'm going to go ahead and hop on the wiki here, and you can see we have this example here. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this here, paste that there, and now you can see we have this setup here. Also, this position should be changed to origin, so make sure you do that because the example is using pause instead of origin. Okay, so now that we have that, what we're going to want to do is set up some form of cam distance, because right now you can see that this is, if I go ahead and just save this, and I'm going to remove the alive check here. You can now see we're kind of in like this third person. This is kind of what we want. We want to basically start at 0 distance and then increment this number here. So for example, you can see now that's half the distance. So that's kind of what we want. But what we're going to want to do is actually create a variable here called cam dist. And so I'm going to go up here and I'm going to say local cam dist equals, and we'll say 0. Okay. So we'll just maintain this value at 0, and then what we're going to want to do is whenever the whenever the player dies, we want to also reset this cam distance back to 0, just for future reference. So now that we have this cam distance variable, what we can do is apply some changes to it. So inside our CalcView, what we want to do now is say cam dist equals, and then we're going to clamp this value here so we don't go too far out. We'll say cam dist, the current value of it, plus 5, and we'll do times frame time. And the reason why we're doing frame time is just so that this addition of 5 will be consistent across all frame rates. After that, what we want to do is set the minimum value, which will be 0, and then the maximum distance, which will be 50 units. Now what we want to do is just go ahead and plug in this cam distance into here. And so now if we go ahead and save this, you can now see that we're kind of slowly fading away. And we only want to do this whenever the player is dead. So let's go ahead and add back this check. Okay, and now I'm going to die. And now you can see that the camera is slowly fading away. Looks good. I like it. Okay, so now what we need to do is go ahead and update the angles that we're using for our view here. So what I'm going to do is create a variable called newAng, and we're going to set it to an empty angle. We have the angles here, which is the player's current angles. So we're going to go ahead and paste that in. We can just do angles.x, angles.y, and angles.z, and there will be no change whatsoever. What we want to do now is manipulate the x and the z. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add 5 times, and then what we're going to do is something a little fancy here. We're going to use math.sine, and then in sine we're going to pass cur time times 5. All right, and then what I'm going to want to do is actually do the same thing here for our z here, but I'm going to just change instead of 5 just for 10. And this is going to be a little bit confusing, but I'm going to explain it in just a moment. So we're no longer going to be using the angles here. So what I'm going to want to do, instead of getting the angles forward, I'm going to get this angle forward and then replace our view.angles with the new angle that we just created. So don't worry, I'll break this down in just a second. But to show what that is like, if I go ahead and kill myself now, oh, you can see that that is way too fast. So the reason for that is this should, instead of 5, this should be 0.5. And let's go ahead and do that again. And now you can see that our camera is kind of rotating and fading away. So that works out just fine. So to break this down, what is happening here? Well, in math.sine, if you pass in cur time, this number is going to be constantly going up every single second, right? And so what we want to do here is this is essentially going to determine our distance between our maximum and minimum on a graph. So if you think about sine on a graph, it goes up and down like this. This number here is going to be, I don't remember the correct term, but it's going to be our maximum and minimum. So in math.sine, the number will go up to 5, and then it will go down to -5. And so this is essentially adding 5, or sorry, numbers between 5 and -5 constantly, and to determine which number that it's at will be determined by cur time. So now that we have that, we are good on terms of our movement and our camera. We're good in terms of our colors. The next portion that we want to do is go ahead and set up our HUD Paint. So I'm going to go ahead and set up a color here. I'm just going to call this red, and this will be 203 9182. So this is a nice red color that they use for the wasted text. The first thing we want to do is store a variable for our player, which is going to be POY, and then we want to do if POY alive, similar to our CalcView, then return end. So we don't want this to happen if the player is alive. Additionally, if there's no death key, we can just go ahead and also return end. Next, we're going to need to store the screen width and screen height in some variables. So let's do that because we are going to be working with that. Then what we want to do is just go ahead and draw out some simple text. So I'm just going to say wasted. We'll go ahead and do tutorial 90. So it's nice and big. We're going to take the screen width, do 0.5, screen height by 0.5. So it's directly in the center. The text will be red. And then we're going to do text align center for the X and Y position. So if I go ahead and save this now, and we got a little script here, then expected near return. Oh, just right there. Make sure you have the then on line 55. Okay. Now go ahead and kill myself. And now you can see we have the wasted text looks okay. What I want to do is actually just add in some outline to it. So I'm going to go ahead and create basically the same thing, but just subtract 2 on the X and Y positioning, and we'll do black. And so now you can see wasted is drawing behind it again. So this is essentially drawing the word twice, but we have a little black outline. So it just looks a little bit nicer with the shadow. Cool. Okay. So now what I want to do is have this text fade in. And so there's many ways to do this. One way to do it is by doing surface set alpha multiplier. Okay. If I go ahead and just set this to 0.5, just to give you an example here, you can see that the text is 50% in the opacity. So we want to go ahead and make some form of get some form of number that climbs up between 0 and 1. 1 meaning it's completely solid, 0 meaning you can't see it at all. So we have this number which is called cam distance, right? And so this will climb up constantly whenever our player dies. So we're actually going to manipulate that into setting up the fading of our text. So I'm just going to create a little variable here called local r. And what I'm going to do is set this to the cam distance. So this is going to be climbing up from 0 all the way up to 50. And we're going to divide this by, for example, 20. So whenever the cam distance is climbing up, if you have 0 divided by 20, that will give you 0. However, if you have, for example, cam distance is at the value of 10 and you divide that by 20, it will give us our 0.5. And if we have cam distance all the way up to the value of 20 and we divide by 20, then it will be 1. So that's just a quick example. I'm going to go ahead and do 25, and I'm going to go ahead and plug in R now. So if I save this and I go ahead and die, you can now see we have the text which fades in. Very beautiful. If we want this to go a bit slower, we could go ahead and set this to 50. And now you can see it takes a bit longer, but I like it fast. So we'll just do 25. Okay. Now that we got that going, the next thing we want to go ahead and set up is some form of restriction. As you notice that I kept on respawning immediately. There's no really delay on it. So to go ahead and set up our own delay, what we're going to want to do is head into our shade file here, and I'm just going to create a little table called death screen, and I'm going to store the value respawn time, and let's just say 6 seconds. So you have to wait 6 seconds. Then after that, what we're going to want to do is head into the server side, and if we go ahead and return false in this player death think, which will determine whether or not the player can respawn, if I just go ahead and return false and I die and I spam the space bar, I'm clicking, nothing is happening. Another thing that you should also notice is if you return true, this was a little weird, you still can't respawn. However, if you return nothing, then you're good to respawn. So that's just something to keep in mind. So what we want to do now is we're going to be using timers. And so whenever the player dies, we're going to create a timer which will basically prevent the player from respawning. So I'm going to do timer.create. And then I'm going to do the victim, which that died, and we're going to use their Steam ID. And the reason for this is because if you create a timer and you don't use a unique name for it, and that timer gets recreated, it will overwrite that previous timer, so it does not ever execute. So you want to make sure that your timers are unique in terms of name, so that each player can have their own unique cooldown. So I'm just going to go ahead and concatenate respawn time. And then the next value that we're going to do is the total time before this timer is complete, which is going to be our respawn time. So I'm going to pass that into there. The next argument is how many times this timer is going to loop. If I just do 1, this timer will just execute, and then it will basically no longer exist. Okay. And then the fourth and final argument is a function, which is the callback on what's going to happen. We don't really want anything to execute, so we're just going to leave this as an empty function. Okay, now that we have that, we're going to go ahead and inside our player death link, we're going to do some conditions here to determine whether or not the player can respawn. So we're going to say if the timer does not exist, and the timer is going to be the player, Steam ID, respawn time, then we're just going to return, meaning we're going to allow that respawn to happen. Else, if the timer does exist, then we're going to return false, and if we remember, that will prevent the player from respawning. So now if I go ahead and die now, I'm spamming space, click, nothing's happening, yada yada yada, but after a while, I'm pretty sure we can respawn, and it worked. Okay, so that's good. Next thing we want to do, I believe this is the final thing as well, we're going to go ahead and add in some form of text that says, press this to respawn. And so what we're going to do now is we need to recreate the same timer at the same time on the client, and that way we can go ahead and get the time of that timer on the client and use that to determine whether or not we should draw some text. So whenever we send the death, basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to paste that same thing here. Instead of victim, since we're on the client, we're going to say local player. And now that timer will exist whenever we send the death, which just happens to be the same time that the timer is created on the server. So we'll have this timer here, which is our respawn time. And then what we're going to want to do now is inside our HUD Paint, if we scroll down to here, we can say if the timer does not exist, meaning that they are now able to respawn, we're going to do POI Steam ID, and then we're going to use that same exact identifier, respawn time. Then we're going to draw some text here. So what I'm going to want to do now is just take this here, slap that there, and we'll say press the space bar to respawn. And our font size, we're going to go ahead and bring that down to our 24, because this is going to be like kind of like a subtitle here. And let's just want to move this down just a bit, and we'll do color underscore white. Okay. So now if I go ahead and die, you can now see we get this nice little fading. The text fades in, the colors go out, and then boom, press the space bar to respawn so we know that this is working. So that will basically conclude our tutorial on how to make a GTA-like death screen. There's a number of things you can do. You can add in sound effects for whenever the player dies. You can make this movement of the camera a bit nicer, so I strongly recommend that you do that. But yeah, so that will conclude that. I'd appreciate it if you guys subscribe, like the video, comment down below if you have any questions. Also, keep in mind I'm going to be doing a giveaway of a bunch of add-ons and coupons whenever I reach 1,000 subscribers. Just head into my Discord for more info on that. And yeah, have a good day, guys. Bye-bye.